Again, Jeff Abbott, and representing Global Scaling Academy, which is a new undertaking that is just formally launching this past summer in anticipation of the book called Blitzscaling, which is going to launch on October 9th. So I'm working with Chris Ye and Reid Hoffman, the authors of the book, and this book represents their attempt to understand what has been the success of Silicon Valley in scaling. Why is it that, you know, you look around the world and many startups are starting everywhere, but what is it about Silicon Valley that has led to the success in scaling? And, you know, as a little bit of history, all of us have traveled to many ecosystems around the world. I think I've been in 20 different international cities, probably in the last 2 years. Everywhere I go, and this is including in the United States, in small cities or second or third tier cities, you hear the same concerns, right? You hear the same concerns from the startup founders. We've got something going here, but we just can't scale. Nobody will invest in us. Or you hear from the investors, there's more money than ever. We've got plenty of dry powder sitting here, but we just can't find anything that we're comfortable investing in. And there's this gap in the middle that the two sides can't seem to connect. Further, if you start talking to the government or the business or economic development groups that are putting in place incentives, the grants that are allowing startups or incubators to get started, or even sometimes putting money into venture funds, they will say, you know, we've been working for 5 years, 10 years, putting tremendous time and tremendous money into the startup community, and where are the successes? Why is nobody able to scale? And so you may say, when you think about Silicon Valley, well, it's worked because there's all these really smart people there, right? There's Stanford and there's Berkeley. But then you look around the world and you see there's great universities everywhere. There's fantastic, smart, talented people literally everywhere. In fact, many of the people in Silicon Valley are people that came there from other places, right? So and then people will say, oh, but there's all the technology. There's the technology firms that have been there for so many years and the advanced patents and so forth. But then you look around and you see the amazing research and technology that is coming in so many places, right? Hard research, new development, it's happening everywhere. And then some people will say, well, Silicon Valley works because there's venture capitalists there and they invest. But, you know, the reality is there's more money today in the world than there has ever been, right? There's greater income inequality in most countries, which means there's more rich people than ever. And there's more money floating around right now to invest in anything, right? In fact, much of the new money that's coming into Silicon Valley, into venture funds, is coming from places like China or the Middle East, right? The sovereign wealth funds. Everybody's looking for something to invest in. So why is it that, you know, the startups can't seem to find this success? What is the disconnect? And so the answer that Reid and Chris determined, and this is something that they worked on over the course of 4 years. And it started out, you know, trying to ask that question, what is it that's really going on here that's different, given that all these things that people commonly assume are the success of Silicon Valley are not, in fact, the real answer. It's not about the talent. It's not about the technology. It's not about the money. These things are everywhere. So what is it that's going on? And the answer they came up with, they had to invent a cool new word. And the word they invented was blitzscaling. And so blitzscaling is what we're going to talk about today. The way I look at it is it's a corporate strategy that works for any business. So if you've studied, you know, business, you've studied Porter's 5 forces, or you've looked at the BCG matrix, you've looked at different frameworks that allow you to analyze a business, right? So blitzscaling, we believe, is something that you can apply to a large corporation, or you could think about at the very earliest stages of forming a new startup in ideation, at the same time that you're looking at a business model canvas, but that is particularly appropriate when you're actually beginning your scaling journey, right? And so blitzscaling, the answer, what is it that's going on in Silicon Valley, is this combination of a willingness to take risk, a combination of the experiences that people have learned together in a small community, where people can talk to each other, where investors learn from each other and see that certain people have taken risks or done things that go a little bit against the expectations and that have allowed them to take risks and achieve success that other people haven't taken. And so the real goal of putting this work out, if you were to ask, Reid Hoffman, what is the goal number one about this book, is to share this information, to share these thoughts and techniques everywhere in the world so that more people can achieve scaling success right where they are in their home communities. Why is that important? Well, if you're, as one of the gentlemen that spoke earlier today said, hopefully all of us have some kind of a mission in our life. Hopefully all of the companies that we're pursuing are solving a problem and in some small way give us a sense of purpose and the belief that we're helping make the world a better place. So one of the things that motivates us in starting Global Scaling Academy is the fact that the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals suggest that the world needs 600 million new jobs by 2030. And where are these jobs going to come from? Are they going to come from 60 million startups that only achieve the ability to have 10 people and then don't grow any further? Most of them likely repeating what one another is doing, consuming duplicate capital, not actually sharing and improving something meaningfully. Or is it likely to come from 6,000 companies that are able to grow to 10,000 employees and achieve massive scale, create massive wealth, and really change the world in many ways? And so it's our hope that we can make our small contribution. So this is the purpose of Global Scaling Academy. Is this the okay? And so together we've started these two entities. Global Scaling Academy, we're doing events, workshops, and programs, as well as kind of consulting with scaling companies. And then Blitzscaling Ventures is an investment fund that's designed to work with companies that are on a proven track to scaling, most likely at the Series B stage, or A to B, or B and beyond. So both of these are launching concurrently. So we'll start out with a little kind of quiz. Think back in history and think about a company and what do you think these numbers represent? They're startup metrics. What company do you think these numbers may represent?
Company which provide that.
Yeah, so think back to the early days of the sort of dot-com era, Silicon Valley, well-known companies, typical metrics that you look at in measuring startup growth, and begin to think about what company. I'm not giving you any hints here on what the numbers mean until I hear some guesses, but no, startups. That's one of them. Numbers of employees. Revenue. Customers.
Hey.
So this company in the period 1996 to 1999 grew the number of its employees 50x, grew the number of its customers 94x, and grew its revenue 322x. Any guesses what company this may have been in the time period 1996 to 1999?
Google.
Good guess, but Google actually hadn't started yet.
Amazon.
Amazon. In fact, here we are today. Thank you, Amazon, for this beautiful facility and the nice lunch. But yeah, this was Amazon 1996 to 1999. Now, how many of you that are here today that have a startup would not like to have numbers like this? Would you like to grow your customers by 94x and your revenues 322? Of course, right? But do you have any idea what it involves to grow your employees by 50x? Right? And therein lies the challenge. So this was Amazon 1996 to 1998. Yes, sir.
Do you remember how many rounds did they go through in this period?
I don't.
Me neither.
No, but this was,
whether it was 2, 3, 4.
no, at this point, this was the point where they were still just selling books. You know, it's the time period where you see, I think, yeah, of course they fundraise, but I don't have those statistics here with me right now. But they basically started as a company with 5.1 million in revenue, which is not too far away from where some of you probably are, right? You might look at that number and say, I'm not that far. You know, I could get to that number, or maybe I've already passed that number. They had 151 employees and 180,000 customers. Jeff Bezos was sitting at a folding table like this in a terrible office somewhere. He didn't have beautiful facilities like this. And in just a period of 3 years, they grew to 1.64 billion with 7,600 employees and 16.9 million customers. Yep. Okay.
Zero. That was the reason why I put the question.
By Crunchbase, they had a round of 8 million euros in the rankings, 95 before, and the following round was in 2001.
So this was all after their seed stage round. This is all just growth hacking, and all they were selling at this point was books.
Just books.
Yeah. At this point, they were still only selling books. And think about this. This is only 20 years ago, right? 20 years ago, the world's most valuable company was General Electric. The world's most admired CEO was Jack Welch, and that company had a market capitalization of $500 or $600 billion. Today, that storied company that has been around for more than 120 years has been delisted from the stock exchange. The CEO is dealing with divestiture and selling of assets because something stopped working, right? In spite of many attempts to digitize and go back and change the culture and so on. So this is nothing short of transformative, right? And it represents the signs, the early signs of a new way of doing business. And of course, we all know what has happened since then. The other thing that happened since then is Jeff Bezos's biceps got a lot bigger. He used to be skinny like me, and now you look at him and, you know, so maybe with great wealth comes bigger biceps. Nope. So there's an animation that's not working here. But anyway, so when you look at Silicon Valley, the real secret is there are many startup hubs in the world, but it's still really the only scale-up hub, right? So if you look on the left, these are all companies minus Salesforce, which just got added to the list here in the last month. These are all the unicorns, the $100 billion technology startups. This is Silicon Valley on the left, and then you have China in the middle. You have 3 more located in the United States, Amazon, Microsoft, and IBM, Seattle and Dallas, and then 1 in Europe, SAP. And so how is it that 10 out of 17 of these companies are located in Silicon Valley, where there's only 4 million people compared to 1.2 billion in China? Now, China's coming on very strong, and there will probably be 5 more companies on this list in the next 5 years. But again, what the authors set out to discover was what were the things that the companies in Silicon Valley had done or done differently that could be learned and transmitted to other places. And the answer was blitzscaling. And so the short definition of blitzscaling is the pursuit of rapid growth by prioritizing speed over efficiency in spite of uncertainty. So if you unpack that and you look at each one of those words independently, rapid growth. Okay, everybody wants to have rapid growth, and it's easy to understand. Let's look back at the dot-com era, where you maybe have Webvan or some of these early companies where the mantra there was raise a lot of money and grow fast, right? Just grow. And it was a spectacular failure, right? They bought offices, they bought ads, they were just growing and growing, but there were no profits, right? I remember looking at this and studying this at the time and really having a difficult time understanding how they were coming up with these valuations. Why were investors just giving them money, right? And so the idea was just build it and people are going to come. But almost none of the companies that started, with the exception of Amazon, Google, and a couple others, actually even survived that period of time, right? And so we know that blitzscaling can also turn into blitzfailing, right? Unless you have the right strategy in place. And so what was it that people learned after the dot-com 1.0 area? What has been different in the last 5 to 10 years that suggests that there is something to be learned here? By prioritizing speed over efficiency. So efficiency is probably where most of you are at now, right? Resources are scarce. You have raised some money, maybe not enough. Your revenues are coming in, but you have to be very, very careful about the decisions you make with each resource. And uncertainty is probably still very present. Maybe you're still trying to find product market fit. Maybe you still don't have that complete replicable process. So you're still cautious. So what's different about blitzscaling? So we came up with this 4x4 matrix with uncertainty and certainty on the left and efficiency and speed in the column. So when you're starting up, of course, there's a lot of uncertainty. So again, you're focused on being efficient, using all of your limited time and your resources with great caution. As things get a little more certain, you start to scale. You're scaling up now. And of course, you're still being very efficient with your resources because again, you still haven't got everything perfect product market fit. You haven't got a completely replicable process. You're still resource constrained. So you're scaling, but you're not at a place yet, for example, where you could go get a loan from a bank, where you could just say, you know what, this is nice and predictable and anybody's going to give me money. That's fast scaling. In fast scaling, you've got the thing down, it's running like a machine, and almost anybody would probably invest in it, right? At this point, you don't have trouble raising capital. But this isn't what approach was taken by Google. This isn't what Uber did. This isn't what Airbnb has done. They didn't pass through those stages. They went straight from someplace in these other categories, in starting or scaling, and they went straight over to blitzscaling. So one thing about blitzscaling is it can begin at any time. It doesn't require you to be at a certain stage. It's something that is an aspirational state. It's something that you can go into and out of at different stages in your journey, right? So the way to think about blitzscaling is when all the variables are working in harmony and you're kind of achieving maximum growth and it's sustainable, but you'll fall in and out of this at different stages. The other thing that's very important to mention about blitzscaling is it's relative to the competition, right? So the first question we get, the most important one is, well, what if my company can't blitzscale? Does that mean this way of thinking is not useful or applicable to me? And the answer is no, because blitzscaling is relative to your competition, right? So if you're in a business that has certain dynamics and you have certain competition and you believe there's an advantage to being the first mover at scale or the one that goes fastest, if there's a sustainable, lasting advantage, to being the one that gets biggest fastest, then you should scale faster than your competitors. But if that's not true, then that would be not a good decision, right? So we can't say that if I'm not Uber or if I'm not Airbnb, therefore I can't think this way. It's relative to you, your company, your competitive set, your industry, and this moment in time. So here's a case study that illustrates an example of what, when you look back in history, you would say was a decision to blitzscale. So in 2002, a very young Google was a company that had decided to enter into a partnership with AOL. At the time, AOL was the big company, right? And at this time, they made a deal where they wanted to power the search function for AOL. They're still a very, very small company. They have large publicly traded competition like Inktomi or Overture. Many thousands of employees, access to capital markets. And they cut a deal with AOL to give 85% of their revenue, that the monetization from their search, 85% of that would go to AOL, and they would keep 15%. Further, they guaranteed $150 million in guaranteed minimum revenue. At that time, they only had $15 million in the bank. So what if you were the board of directors of Google and the CEO came to you and said, I've got this great opportunity. I want to bet the company on this. Now, if we're not successful, we're going to end up $150 million in debt in 1 year. Would you have agreed with that? So if you had agreed with that, it must have been because you knew something or you believed something very strongly. And so we must assume, because we know how things worked out, that Google did know something and believe something. And the fact was, it's even worse. In this environment, the NASDAQ had just fallen and everybody was scattering, right? Everybody was running away from this sector. And instead, they decided to double down and do something very, very counterintuitive. Why would they do that? Well, they knew that their search engine worked differently. The other ones were simply auction-based. They were based on whoever bid the most would serve higher in the search rankings. But they also knew that they were balancing relevance with the bid. And therefore, over time, the more data that came through their algorithms, the smarter they would get, the better they would serve relevant searches, and the more they would be able to monetize. And they knew that enough already to know that if they had this opportunity to have this massive volume, that they would outperform, and that they would outperform their competitors. And so what we do know that happened is it worked out well for them. In 2001, they had $19 million in revenue, and the year after they did this deal, they had 347. And this is really what started the success of Google. So this is an example of doing something very counterintuitive and taking a lot of risk, risking the company, because you're confident that you have a business model innovation that's powered by a technological innovation, and that you believe that if you get the capital to go for it, that you can make it. Yes?
Assumption, because they knew that some data from AOL, because they must. They needed to do the math, because if they have known that 2002 or 2001 AOL with others did already over 1 billion, and they know how much they can outperform the others, they could have come out this number. They must. It's not a pure bet. I don't think.
Well, they obviously knew a lot more than I know here telling the story, for sure. But it still was a big risk.
Yeah, it was a big risk.
It's a big risk. And of course, what they really got was access to the volume. Now, if their monetization method had not been effective, then they could have failed, right? So you may say that they knew it was going to be a great success, but it still was a very large and unexpected risk, right? And it certainly caught their competition off guard. I understand your point. So what is it that makes blitzscaling possible? It's the combination of the two things that go into a rocket ship. So the analogy that Chris and Reed have come up is that blitzscaling is like building a rocket, right? It's trying to build something that's going to move so fast and yet keeping it from exploding, from blowing up or going off course, right? So anybody, you know, if you watch the world of missile making, right, we have a lot of people in the world today that are having fun building missiles and experimenting with them in different places, but it's not always easy to stop a missile from blowing up or to get it to go where it's supposed to go. And so there's an art and a science to this that need to be balanced. So the first is capital, that you can't blitzscale unless you have access to capital. And the second is you need the right talent. And so these are two things that have come together, obviously, in Silicon Valley. However, right now, there is a tremendous shortage of talent, which was actually alluded to earlier. I think it was by, was it Claudio, who spoke about the difficulty and the cost of finding talent. In fact, right now in Silicon Valley, there's a total war for talent. People regularly leave, one job for another. People have incredible big titles, and you see then you look that they've only been in the job for a couple years. And so there's this tremendous inflation of everything right now because money is so plentiful, so easy to come by, valuations are so high. But are these latest companies that are actually going to succeed? Do the people running them really have the experience that their titles suggest? We will have to see. But from an investor standpoint, at least the ones I've talked to lately, people would actually love to look at real people who are running real companies, who are actually focused on building enterprise value and building something for the long term, who are not just looking to cycle through a job and quickly cash out and move on to the next thing, right? So this is one of the things that gives me great confidence coming to a program like this here, is that some of these things that are playing out in Silicon Valley are not occurring here yet, right? So why is scale so important? It's one of the 4 things that makes a digital business defensible, right? So scaling, when it comes to scaling, speed matters most if you believe that you're in a winner-take-most or a winner-take-all market, right? So how many of you seen the old movie from the 1990s that was called, it's an American movie called Glengarry Glen Ross with Alec Baldwin? Anybody seen this movie? Okay, so there's a scene in the movie, even though you haven't seen it, where this guy, he's a sales manager, he comes in and he's got his team of salespeople around, and he's a real asshole, right? They sent him down from the corporate office to get the sales guys motivated. And he says, so here's what's gonna happen. We're gonna run a competition. The person that wins the competition gets a Cadillac. The guy that comes in second gets a set of steak knives. And the third place person and everybody else is fired. Okay? So in a winner-take-most or a winner-take-all market, some people in the US at least call it a Glengarry Glen Ross market, which means if you win, you get the Cadillac. And who really wants a set of steak knives? Nobody, right? And the third is you're fired. So using that analogy, if you look at consumer social media, who won the Cadillac? Which company took the market? Facebook, right? Can anybody, who's in second place? Twitter maybe, Snapchat, 600, 800 billion valuation versus 1/10 or 1/20th of that, right? The Cadillac and the steak knives. What about in the search business? Is there anybody left at all in second place? Really, I mean, Google owns YouTube and that's the number 2, so, right? And so there is this dynamic. If you believe you're in a market that it's winner take most or winner take all, then you have to go fast. You really don't have a choice. And the reality is, in today's world, you don't actually know who your competition is yet. There's a lot of adjacencies out there. There's brilliant people in every part of the world thinking about exactly the same problem. Like with the amount of travel that I do, I can tell you that I see in many different markets almost the identical startup forming in many, many different places. And they're clearly not aware of one another yet, right? Somebody's in Argentina, somebody's in Italy, and they're all starting basically the same business to solve the same problem. At some point, you become aware of each other if you scale out of your home market. So if it really is a big market and somebody's going to become the global winner, then you should assume, right, that you need to go fast because you don't even know what you don't know. But certainly there's somebody else out there working on the same problem right now. And another one is network effects that's highly important. Companies with strong network effects built into the business model tend to win and win very big. In fact, there's a firm in Silicon Valley, a venture capital firm called NFX, that did a study recently and concluded that if you take out Microsoft from the equation, which was started in the 1980s, that 70% of all the value that has been created since 1994 in tech companies has come from businesses that have very strong network effects components. And so the definition of a network effect is when each user that joins adds value to the prior users. So every successive user, the entire platform becomes more valuable, more sticky for all successive users. So, right? It's true of almost every business that we can think of that has become big. And then the other two that are widely discussed are, the power of a brand and having a model that can be embedded into other people's businesses. So one of the things that we'll talk about later is letting fires burn. But this is one of Reid Hoffman's favorite sayings. In fact, it's one of the episodes in the Masters of Scale podcast, is the importance of knowing when to let fires burn. So since we're talking about blitzscaling, we're talking about speed. Making mistakes is acceptable. In fact, it's absolutely necessary, right? Because you haven't done this before. You're driving down the road so fast that you have to be willing to make mistakes. You don't have time to study things for 6 months. So rather than prepare to try to fix everything, you've got to let go of things. You've got to have a system for evaluating and triaging and ranking what are the problems that I can let burn, the fires that I can continue to let burn, and what are the mission critical things that I need to solve right now, right? So again, using the example of the rocket ship, there was the Apollo 13 instance where the oxygen pump broke, right? Now this was obviously more important than finishing the mission and completing the other science projects, right? Because if they didn't fix the oxygen pump, they were all going to die in 36 hours. So by way of analogy to the rocket ship, you've got to know what are those things that are truly about survival and what are not. When you're first getting started, everything looks like a fire, right? But as you gain some experience, you start to understand which ones to leave burning. So the key here is to, as you're making a mistake, if you're the founder and the leader, and you allow a fire to keep burning, people are going to look at you and question your leadership. They're going to say, I don't understand why you continue to waste money on that, or why you continue to spend time on this, right? And so you have to communicate and explain, I'm making a conscious choice to let this problem continue to be a problem because I'm seeking to accomplish this. And this is more important right now. And for these reasons, we can ignore this. In terms of talent, if you can't find the people that you need, we heard from a recruiter earlier this morning, this gentleman right here, talking about the amount of time that's required to find people. In our experience, a lot of times you can't even find the people. They may not exist. There's a story from Marissa Mayer, who was the CEO of Yahoo, about how she was hired at Google and asked to do a job. She was employee number 20, and she was asked to do a job that she had no idea how to do. Well, why are you picking me for this? I have absolutely no experience with this. And the answer was, I like you. I like that you're good at data. And I like your values. And I believe in your ability to experience this and to learn, right? And so there's a concept here that we refer to as tours of duty. A lot of times, if you look into the old world of work, people that are looking at a job working for you versus maybe working at Amazon or another well-established company, a large bank, for example, they may be looking at it as a job, right? Like you're supposed to take care of them and provide them stability and benefits. But in fact, you have to have a conversation with them like, this is a startup, I'm building something, and I want to bring you into this journey. Now, if they're a founder, you might say, or if you're thinking of bringing them in as a co-founder, articulate really clearly to them that, this is my vision, these are my values, this is what I'm trying to build, and I'm thinking of you as someone that forms a part of the foundation of this company. I'm not looking at this as a job, like what is the degree of commitment that I'm expecting from you? In other words, is your commitment the same as mine? So at the earliest stage, like 0 to 10 employees, what we call the family stage, almost everyone needs to be like a founder, needs to be a generalist. Yeah.
I think there is a very massive debate about this.
Yep.
Because there's a real big trade-off between hire the right people
For sure.
and build them. Because if I'm a young startup, it's not always true that I have all the competencies that it needs to build the right team.
For sure.
Underneath. And I want to hire people best of myself. That are best of me and that can bring a new fuel to my company. So there is a kind of trade-off. Probably depends on the stage of people you have to hire also, and not only about the stage of maturity of the startup. It depends, but I'm not sure that is always the best way to follow.
So the question, I think it comes down to, and we'll talk about this in a second, is the question of generalists versus specialists at what stage of the organization. So when you're still small, and you need to be able to change and pivot fast, we believe it's more important to hire generalists. A generalist is someone that, is flexible, is able to do almost anything that you ask them to do. Like if you say, today I need you to figure out where to get us a new office, how to, change the accountant, and then they can also do a little bit of this and a little bit of that, that's much more important to have that adaptability in the early team, and to not try to hire specialized people too early, right? Because then, maybe they're only good at that, but perhaps you made a mistake and you actually weren't ready to have a sales manager yet. This is our belief that staying focused on generalists at the early stage until you get some of that replicability is important. So the question would be then, when should I blitzscale? And the answer is when you have the presence of certain growth factors and when several things that really limit your growth are not present. So the growth factors are a very big market. So if you believe that your market is very, very, very big, then clearly there's going to be an advantage to being the first mover at scale, who takes a dominant position and holds everyone out. So this reminds one of the story going back to about 2012. There was an economist at New York University that published a study saying that the maximum value for Uber was going to be $100 million, because the global taxi market, or the US taxi market, was about a $1 billion market, and he didn't think they could get much more than maybe 10 or 15% of that. So was he right? No, right? And so what happened was there was a completely expanded market out there, right, of people who were willing to find other solutions and people who were willing to offer themselves as transportation providers that met a need that most people hadn't detected. And there was also, for the first time, a technology that was able to solve that, right? So it was the combination of a business model innovation with the technology innovation that caught even the experts off guard. The same thing is true with Airbnb, who famously went to Fred Wilson, a very famous VC, and asked for investment, and he laughed at them. He said, "This is crazy. I don't want strangers staying in my house, and I don't want to stay in somebody else's bedroom. I mean, what's wrong with a hotel? Clean towels, toiletries, right?" And he was wrong too. Why did he bet on Airbnb? Because of the team. Because they kept coming back and kept coming back and kept answering his questions. And he was so convinced that, even though he didn't believe that this was actually going to work, that if anybody could make it work, they could. And that's a story that I've heard over and over at the stage you're at as well, and someone actually presented that this morning as well, that for investors at your stage, that showing yourself as the strong team, the committed team that can overcome the challenges that are thrown at you is probably the most important thing to get across. So find a way during the event platform, in addition to all the other questions you're going to answer, to try to demonstrate why you. Massive distribution plus some virality built into the product. So usually a good product with great distribution will beat a great product with bad distribution every time, right? So it's not often that you have the best product and great distribution unless you're already the incumbent. And so how can you get access to other people's distribution? What partnerships can you form? What ways can you embed into some other business model or plug into an ecosystem that immediately gives you access to other people's already existing distribution? If you can do that, then chances are you're going to be able to scale a lot faster. Does your business have high gross margins? Gross margins obviously are important because you need capital to scale, right? And there's two ways to get that, from investors or from your customers. So of course, you're going to be in a favorable position if your business has high gross margins, because the business itself is producing the revenue that you need to scale. And if you're working against competitors and your gross margins are relatively better, you're more resource efficient, then you will generate more of the resources that you need to go faster than them. So one of the things that we like to talk about a lot is, how aware are you of your gross margins? How carefully are you calculating them? And have you really begun to think about that and measure that? Most people at this stage are only thinking about revenue. And maybe revenues are the things that investors are asking most about. But it's actually more important to be able to talk about the percentage of revenue that's transferred into margin and how you're employing that, right? What are you getting? How are you converting revenue into energy? Network effects, obviously, are what allow you to build this enduring competitive advantage. And so a lot of times, in my experience, people start out building businesses and they get to where they are because they had a vision and just sheer strength of will and energy. They get to where they are. And something is working. Maybe there's product market fit. Maybe you're still working on that, but you haven't necessarily sat back theoretically and asked yourself, how would I redesign this business model for scale? Right? Because you've just been doing it. And a lot of times, if you're doing it for the first time, like if this is your third or fourth startup and you've been very successful and studied all the lessons, maybe you would come back at this a little differently and with much more conscious awareness say, I'm consciously going to try to find and design a business model with all of these elements. But that's not where most people are. And so how can you go back and think about your business now as you prepare to scale and take capital, and ask yourself, to what degree are these elements present in my business? How could I begin to build network effects into my business, even if they're not there now? What would that look like? What do I need to start working on or learning, or who do I need to talk to? And obviously, product market fit is critical to your ability to scale. Many of you right now have some degree of product market fit, but I would imagine you would all confess that it's something you're still working on, still getting feedback. And you can grow rapidly. In fact, how many people remember Groupon? How many people have used a Groupon before? Did this, yeah. And what about how many people have used a Groupon in the last, say, 1 month? Right? So not very long ago, Groupon was the fastest growing company in history. The fastest growing company in history. And today, they have fallen off, lost most of their value, and most people, you know, consider it a great shame that the founders didn't accept the $6 billion from Google in stock a few years ago, right? I mean, that's probably a very painful mistake. I mean, the guy, you know, he made some money, but he turned down $6 billion in Google stock. Why did Groupon fail? Because the product sucked, right? They didn't ever really have product market fit. The merchants hated it, and the customers hated it. And after they finally figured that out, they tried to go back and fix it and start talking to the merchants about, now that you've given away something at a loss, and the people never came back, right? Because they just went to the next Groupon. You never became loyal. You just went to the next guy that gave you something that you knew was a great deal. And so everybody lost on Groupon. So obviously, this is the importance of product market fit. You want to make sure that you have that you really believe that that's as strong as it can be before you blitzscale, before you take an insane amount of money and try to grow too fast. Because if not, you know, you could get to the point where Groupon died. And then another consideration is, can your competitors blitzscale? Because again, blitzscaling is relative. And you can take the word blitzscaling out of this. Maybe it's a little too trendy of a word. Do you believe that your competitors are in a position to scale faster than you? And if so, why? Have you thought about that? Have you thought about who they are and what their resources are? And if you believe that they're in a position to scale faster than you, then that's a real point of concern, right? And it may be a life or death decision for you to decide, you know, whether I'm ready or not, whether I have as much certainty as I should, whether I feel comfortable. I really don't have any choice, right? Because if they're scaling faster than I am, and we both have similar products, if they beat me, then I fail, right? And I get the steak knives. So if you can meet most of these conditions, then you should consider scaling faster relative to your competitive set. And if you don't believe you can, then probably you should continue working on your business model until you're confident that you have some of these more lasting competitive advantages built into it. Otherwise, you may just fail faster. So the stages of blitzscaling, we define them with these 5 stages that are roughly orders of magnitude in the size of your employee base. And again, these are rough numbers, right? They're just kind of meant for descriptive purposes. But the first stage is a family, right? It's the co-founders. It's up to 10 employees. It's the late nights at the office, the pizzas. Everybody's part of the same conversation. It's informal. It's usually full of generalists. When you get to that next stage, we call it a tribe, right? Where there starts to be some extended people. You've got your first employees. Maybe, you know, you hired a first manager of something. You hired some engineers. You've got some, you know, you've got a little bit more formality, but it's still pretty much running the way it did before. There's just a few more people in the room, and not all of them are co-founders. Now, this is probably the stage that most of you are at, where you're at sort of this, I mean, how many people here have 10 employees or fewer? How many people have 10 to 20? How many people have more than 20? More than 50? More than 100? Okay. So based on these descriptions, we're all still in kind of the family to tribe stage, and a lot of the, or tribe to village stage. And so the key thing here about blitzscaling is understanding the transitions that are coming at each stage of growth and anticipating them and beginning to prepare for them. Obviously, the later stages, 100 to 1,000, 1,000 to 10,000, or 10,000 or more. By this point, you're a publicly traded global corporation. The statistics show that fewer than 50% of founders or leaders are actually able to scale from one stage to the next. So like one of the presenters earlier said today, if you're dealing with one of those people that was there as part of the founding team, but they can't make it to the next level, then you speak to them about that. And it's very important to then give them a different role. They're always going to be a co-founder. They're always going to be an owner. They may have a role, and then at some point they may cease to have a role, but they're still very important to the culture. They're very important to the ethos and the sense of belonging. Some of them may leave and go do other things, but they're still an owner. And so it's important at this stage, to begin to think about and differentiate between when you are playing the role of a co-founder and when you're playing the role of an executive, and when you're playing both. And to be able to move seamlessly between those two roles, because one of them implies moral authority and vision and purpose that will never go away, that no one can ever take that away from you. The other one implies position power and authority and decision-making ability outside of the boardroom that you may or may not continue the growth trajectory. You may choose to exit. And so it's important, if you are the co-founder, to clarify in conversations with people which voice you're speaking with. So blitzscaling is something that's iterative. And there's a number of techniques we'll get into and counterintuitive rules that Chris and Reed have discerned from interviews with literally dozens and dozens of some of the best known executives and founders of well-known companies. And the first thing is to do things that don't scale. So this is the classic argument between, should I do something manually or should I automate it, right? And Reed's experience and answer is, do things that don't scale first, and do them until you can't do them anymore, until it's so painful to continue doing them that now it actually makes sense to fix it and allow that to scale. But make the problem of something that's pushing so hard against you be what determines your decision about moving to the next stage. Then you reach the next stage and you have an entirely new playing field. Everything's different now, right? At this next stage of growth. The management processes that work, the communication processes that work, the technology solutions that work, the way you do your payroll and your everything has to change at almost every one of these stages. So if you can make it to the next stage, then you start scaling the things that you can, but then you consciously make the decision to start trying some new things that don't scale.
Why?
Because you have to keep growing. So maybe you've got one product, one feature that you've scaled and you've made it replicable now, but one product likely doesn't make a company, right? And so now, what's that next piece of revenue going to come from? What's the additional thing that you're going to put over here? Is it a, completely new product? Is it a new feature? Is it an upgraded tier of service? As soon as you get the one thing under control, you have to start experimenting with the next and go back to the mindset of the first stage of doing it in a way that doesn't scale, right? And if that works, then revenues lift you to the next stage, and you scale what you can, and you're continually going back. So it's the notion of going from a single thread of activities to multiple threads, which is how you end up with, you know, an organization that has multiple product lines, multiple geographic offices, some products that are unique to a particular geography, right? It starts to look like a decision tree. It all just started with one root, but you have to be thinking consciously about that. And if you succeed in getting to the next stage, well, this is just another iteration. But if you want to keep scaling, you have to keep time in your mind to begin thinking about planting that next set of seeds, and not just 100% of your time focused on the current set of challenges, or you're not adequately looking into the future. So the next two slides are really the, you know, the key summary of the points that have been uncovered in Chris and Reed's research. The key transitions that you make from one stage to the next of scaling. The first is that you will go from small teams to large teams. So at the beginning, just a couple people, they're off working on a little project. The project grows and becomes bigger. Maybe you'll end up having a rule like Amazon that, you know, you're not going to have teams that are larger than 2 pizzas, which seems to have worked very well for them. But the point is the organization gets bigger. There start to be more resources. The nature of communication and management in a team changes, and you should have some thoughts about how you're going to manage that. You're going to go from generalists to specialists over time. And so this goes back to our brief conversation before about, you know, typically the founding team is a lot of generalists, right? And if you end up hiring somebody better than you in every role, well, maybe you're still the generalist, you're the founder, but that person that you brought in to take your job or to take this role is now truly a specialist, an expert that has honed their experience at another, you know, a prior job, and is going to be better than you at that. But it didn't make sense to have them until you knew what that was that you needed them to do. So when in doubt at this stage, continue to look for high utility people that are flexible, adaptable, and able to move in whatever direction things turn out to move, as opposed to committing too soon to highly specialized people. And so this concept of a tour of duty is very important, which is to say, I'm hiring you now for what I can see now, and to be very specific. If everything is chaotic and there's not a clear description of the role, don't create one. Just say, I need you to do whatever the hell needs to be done, and you'll know what that is every day. Or, I need to hire you now. My hope is that you'll be able to grow into, you know, the vice president of sales, but right now I just need you to figure out how to sell something. Going from being a contributor to a manager to an executive, right? And this is a normal thing that happens in everyone's career, right? When you first get out of university, they normally say that, you know, your 20s are the time when you demonstrate that you're competent. You're an individual contributor. You work like crazy, you work long hours, you get good at spreadsheets, you get good at research, you get good at all the technical things that you need to do. And then you get promoted to a manager in your 30s. And then it's about how well do you manage people, and how well do you grow and build other people, right? And then when you become an executive, it's how well do you manage other people, and how well do you play the political game and deal with other stakeholders, right? And so you're continually marching up this pyramid. If a startup is successful, it is going to turn into a major corporation. Facebook, LinkedIn, Airbnb have thousands of employees. They have corporate lawyers and corporate counsels and corporate finance and mergers and acquisitions departments. They work with Wall Street bankers and lawyers. They are no different than fiat or a large bank, right? They just started and grew more quickly. And so people are going to be able to manage that change or not, but 50% of them will likely stay right where they are. They won't be able to make that transition. And one of our speakers this morning pointed out that that in fact had been their experience, and that, you know, you either need to offer them a chance to leave if they can't be happy about being employee number 7, but no longer being the boss of something if they couldn't handle it, or you know, you just need to buy them out and thank them. And the other important thing that comes out of another previous book that Reed and Chris wrote that's called The Alliance is the importance of always thinking about your future success and how your current employees are always going to be a reflection of your company, even if they're no longer with you. So think about how many corporations today have alumni groups, right? Where the former employees of Boston Consulting Group get together for a cocktail, or, you know, all the people that left turn out to be very important sources of network, of information, and they're ambassadors of your company, what they learned from you. And so even if someone is probably not going to be around or chooses to leave, you really do, if you're planning on scaling a company and betting that you'll succeed, you really do need to think about the way you treat people, and if they leave, the way they exit, and what they're going to say about you. Because you obviously want to create a culture that is the place to work, that everybody wants to be in your company. And if everybody that leaves says, no, you know, they treated me really poorly, it wasn't fair, and a bunch of new people came in, and, you know, they all made more money than we did, and it was a mess, right? Then there's going to be a conflicting story in the market. And so thinking already in advance about how you treat people after they've left turns out to be very important. Going from dialogue to broadcasting. So dialogue is the small team now, right? We're all sitting around, we're in the conference room. You got a problem, you walk down to the person and you just talk it out, and you go back and sit down and you have a dialogue and you solve everything. When you get to 50 employees, you don't have time to do that anymore, right? So there's certain things that you start to need maybe to put together a company newsletter. So for example, Brian Chesky at Airbnb famously has an email that he sends out every Sunday night, because the company's so big now that, of course, he doesn't personally know everyone anymore like he used to. But it's very important to him to create the feeling that everybody knows him, that he's a real person, that he's accessible, and he wants to share what he's thinking, what his doubts are, what he's thinking about the future direction of the company. And so he sends like what feels like a very personal letter that goes to all employees on a Sunday night. So that's obviously at the other extreme of a company that's grown very fast. But are there things that you can start thinking about now that you can anticipate if you continue to scale? These are processes that you should have in place. Are there things that you could begin to communicate on a more formalized kind of broadcasting basis? You're going to go from inspiration to data, which is to say, you started out saying, I just know there's a market for that and it's going to work, and I'm going to go do it and I'm going to make it work. And you did that. But when you get to a certain point, you need to have data available to reinforce the decisions you're going to make going forward. Your employees are going to need it. Your investors are going to need it. You're going to want it. How do I know what the right next decision to make is? So are you putting in place already now a culture and a process of collecting and managing and using data? And if not, what needs to happen? You go from a single focus to having multi-threads. So again, project number one, business number one, to if you reach that next stage, you've got multiple things going on, and they're all going on in parallel. And probably one of the most important things here is you go from behaving like a pirate to being in a navy. So a pirate is informal, opportunistic, somewhat mercenary. It's like the early founder. You'll sell anything. You're like, why did you sell that? Well, they were going to buy it. We needed the money. But it's not what we're trying to do. or it's only 50%, but who cares? They paid us, and it's better than not being paid. And so you're very mercenary. But as you continue to grow, you need to have processes in place. You're going to need to have proper payroll systems and proper accounting and finance, and make sure that all of your taxes are taken care of instead of the sloppy way that you're doing it now in an Excel spreadsheet, perhaps, right? You start to have to play by the rules as you get bigger, which requires hiring the specialists, the people that have been at other established companies that know how to do that. A perfect example is Travis Kalanick at Uber, right? Who famously lost his job earlier this year and was replaced by Dara Khosrowshahi. So in addition to all the bad behavior that we heard about, from Travis, the screaming at his drivers and tolerating a culture of harassment, those are the things that made it into the newspaper. But some of the things that we found out later was that even though he was running a 10,000 person organization, that he still ran it like a pirate. He still never, ever once had a meeting with all of his managers, with all of his top executives. There was never an executive committee meeting. Because he was sort of a control freak and he was the founder, it was his preference to meet with everyone one-on-one, so that he would be the only one that actually knew everything that was going on, and he could continue to call all the shots. Clearly that doesn't work at a 10,000 person organization, but he was still trying to run it like it was a 100 person organization. And that was one of the reasons why he was replaced, and replaced by someone who had the experience of running a publicly traded company that would bring more professionalism and order. And so that's an example of someone who failed to scale into their responsibilities. The current president of the United States is another example of someone who has failed to scale into his responsibilities by performing less like a pirate and more like the captain of a navy. There are a number of counterintuitive rules, things that you do when you decide to blitzscale. Again, blitzscale is scaling faster than your competition relative to your particular situation in your industry. The first thing you have to accept, and you have to allow your employees to accept, is things are going to be chaotic, right? It's always going to be like that, right? If you keep scaling, it's never going to be any different, right? Because you're going to get from the first stage to the next one, and great, congratulations, you got the medal. Now you're a $20 million company, but right, if you want to be a $100 million company, it's going to be all different, right? It's just a completely new company. You're reinventing everything again for the first time. It's never going to be any different. So you've got to understand that, embrace that, and surround yourself with people that can handle that. You have to tolerate bad management, right? In other words, things are moving so fast that you don't have time for everyone to be exactly perfect, for every decision to be founded on data and long, careful analysis, right? Like some of the companies, maybe you've all had jobs before at large companies where you're like, oh my God, we've been working on this ship for 6 months. Could somebody make a decision, please? Right? Probably that's why you're all here today, because you all had a job like that and you just couldn't stand it anymore. But you have to tolerate bad management and decisions that might not be perfect, because you have to keep going. You have to be willing to launch a product that embarrasses you, right? It may not look good. Your service may be terrible, but if people are still buying it and you're still growing, then it's a question of which fire to let burn. So for example, how many people have used Craigslist or seen Craigslist? Or what about eBay? Have these products changed in 20 years? No. Right? Did they ever build a good product? No, the design is still terrible. It doesn't do anything more than it did the first year that it launched. But it did do a lot of things right. It had strong network effects, it was viral, it had high gross margins, and it grew to scale first. And now, even though it's a terrible looking product, it's still number one, and no one has been able to knock it out of number one. Amazon, here we are at Amazon. Is Amazon the most beautiful website? No, I mean, probably anybody that's a user experience designer would be able to look through and say, oh my God, there's so many little things that they could do, that they could add this little feature or make this work better, right? But if that gets in the way of speed and convenience and an ability to make a purchase, then, you know, they're not interested in hearing it. So it's the same ethos of just not complicating things. It's good enough. So don't wait and try to get something perfect before you roll it out. Roll it out and see what works and get the customer feedback and just keep behaving like a startup. We've talked about this one before, let fires burn, but it's really a question of prioritization. One of my favorite stories here was the story that Reed has shared about the early days at PayPal with respect to customer service. They had about 10 employees, and when they finally started to scale, they were growing at like 5% a day. And they didn't have a customer service department. They had one phone that was in the book, you know, just their main company phone in Palo Alto. And people started to have some issues with the product, so that phone was continually ringing. And so they ignored their customers. They just let the phone ring. They started using their cell phones for personal business and basically made the decision that we don't care if these customers are unhappy because we're growing at 5% a day, right? We'd rather keep growing at 5% a day than figure out how to answer the phone, because it's more important to take our 10 people and focus on the things that are allowing us to grow 5% a day than worry about the number over here that may be dissatisfied and leave. Eventually, they had to fix that problem, and they flew out to a city out in the middle of the United States, Tulsa, Oklahoma, where somebody in the company, one of the 10 people, had a sister that lived in Tulsa and said, you know, it's really cheap to do business here. So they flew out there, talked to the mayor, got some kind of a deal, rented a building, and most of the team stayed there for a month, and they were hiring, you know, 10 people a day and just saying, answer the phone, respond to this email. There's no training at all. Just try to figure out how to keep this person happy. And about half the people would quit every month. And they just kept growing and growing like that and figuring it out. And today there's still 5,000 people working in a call center in Tulsa, Oklahoma, that they eventually grew to. But right at the time, you just had to pick which thing to focus on. So doing things that don't scale, letting the fires burn that you can get away with, and ignoring your customers, sometimes, as counterintuitive as they are necessary if you want to keep growing. Raise too much money. It was the first speaker this morning that said, always raise money before you need it, because once you have it, I think it was you, right? Because as soon as you need it, then you don't have the leverage and you're not in a position to get it. Your terms are going to be worse. So raise too much money because it gives you options. And finally, continue to evolve the culture to meet the current needs. The culture, not the values. The culture needs to change to fit the stage of the organization you're at, but the core values should remain the same and be very, very codified. So just to hit on some of these points again, a good product with massive distribution will always be a great product with mediocre or limited distribution. Network effects is probably next. Network effects and being the first to scale. One of the most important ways to create the defensibility and building network effects into your business model consciously is important. This is a great source, NFX. Again, it's a venture capital firm in Silicon Valley that primarily focuses on working with companies that either have network effects or that could build them. They've published a couple resources that are very helpful to thinking about that. One is the Network Effects Bible, and the other one is the Network Effects Manual. You can Google both of those and find them, but this describes the different types of network effects on the left, along with the other 4 characteristics of a defensible digital business model. Market size, a question that I think is important for you as you prepare for the event in a month is, how accurately are you describing your market? How accurately are you measuring the value of your market, right? Because the investors that hopefully will decide to fund you after the event are going to be looking at not only your relative ability to scale, but what are you scaling into? And so thinking through what that market is, what it's worth, where it is, you know, maybe you've overestimated it, maybe you've underestimated it. It's quite possible. So being able to describe that very effectively, and of course, going after a bigger absolute market is always going to be better for scaling and better for your ability to raise capital. Lack of product market fit. If you have a product that serves the needs of your users, it's going to get you the growth than just going after virality. In other words, don't build a product and then try to go buy virality with Facebook ads. The product itself should be the virality. How do you think about building virality into the product, right? After you have product market fit, virality is what can make it sustainable. If you achieve virality before you have achieved product market fit, it can kill you. So there's some information in here, and this presentation, Ferruccio and Lorenzo will share it. But you know, if you're trying to get virality too fast, then you may still be missing something. So we think it's important to focus on trying to refine that product market fit and thinking about virality rather than just going to buy it. How many of you are calculating virality now in any way? Maybe it's not appropriate for your business, but it's an aspect of, you know, distribution and virality, right? So there's a lot of different models out there that companies have used to achieve virality. There's, you know, the Dropbox model, there's the YouTube model, there's many different tactics out there that are conscious strategies that you can employ or that you can test to try to build virality into the product. So given that it's another one of the growth factors that is usually present in a business that's able to blitzscale, we encourage you to go educate yourself and read a little bit about this and think, is there some way, just like with network effects, is there some way that we can begin to think about experimenting with building virality into the product? Is that a referral? Is that a, you know, tell a friend? These are sort of early, but there's different kinds of virality that works with different business models. And it's a very simple calculation. When each one of your new users brings in more than one new user, then you have a positive virality coefficient. It's important to time it because growing it slowly over time, along with product market fit, is sustainable, whereas looking at Pokemon Go, it became very viral, but then it disappeared, right? So there obviously was an opportunity to monetize and build something there, but the whole thing just blew up like a can of gasoline. Again, gross margins. Revenue is often seen as the most important, but what about gross margin? It's actually more important because it's tied to your profitability and directly informs your ability to scale. Imagine two companies that sell a product for the same price, one with a 5% gross margin and one with a 95%. Which one can afford to scale, right? So I don't know exactly what all of your models are, but it definitely warrants serious conversation as you prepare to raise money. You know, how carefully are we calculating this? How are we accounting for things, and how can this be fundamentally and strategically improved, right? Because that's particularly important, obviously, as you prepare to raise money, because it's going to have everything to do with your capital efficiency. Investors love high gross margins because, of course, you know, you can see the average here that in year 4, SaaS companies, most of you fall into that category, typically have a 50% gross margin, but by year 5, most of them have grown to 75%, right? So at a certain point, when you figure things out, they tend to improve over time as the efficiencies kick in. So developing the discipline now to start thinking about that and really measuring that will be important. You probably know how to calculate it. And then the final piece that may seem a little obvious is the ability to scale yourself as a founder, which turns out to be one of the critical pieces. And you know, there's a couple of things that in the family and tribe stage tend to be the largest problems that cause startups to fail. One is building a product that nobody wants, or you know, raising too much money before something is proven and then failing. And the second is the incompatibility of the team, which comes down to the founders, kind of like a rock band, right? How many great bands that we really enjoyed, you know, they disappeared because the 2 guys or girls that started the band, you know, ended up hating each other, right? So it really is important to take time to have conversations among you, right? I'm not suggesting you need to get a relationship or a marriage counselor or something like that, but to take the time to have intentional conversations about, you know, what each person needs, right? Like to start to get to know each other on a pretty deep level. Like, you know, I'm like this. This is what makes me happy. This is what makes me feel fulfilled. This is what I need to take a decision. You know, I want to support you, so I want to understand you. I want to get to the point where, you know, I'm creating the safe environment that makes you most effective, and you're doing the same for me, right? And so a lot of times all of this happens so fast that you get to know each other quickly, and but you're still living, you know, in a small space. And the research and the conversations that we've had suggests that, you know, some of these really enigmatic startup teams that have gone on to be so successful, that they really did take time to have these conversations. And so some of the things, the qualities that are important, certainly in a place like Silicon Valley, I'm sure it's true here in Milan or wherever your city is you know, integrity, right? So that may mean a lot of different things to different people, but it could be described as doing what you say you're going to do, or not saying you're going to do one thing and then doing another, right? Particularly in a community of investors, right? So if you know, go in and pitch one thing to one investor and then go tell something else to another investor, I guarantee you, at least in Silicon Valley, they pick up the phone and they call each other. Everybody knows each other, right? So you get caught playing that game of bait and switch a couple times, and there goes your credibility, right? Obviously, determination, the ability to be flexible, to solve problems, to communicate, and taking the time to preserve your emotional health, right? And having these conversations. So you are the engine that's driving all of this. And so if you don't take time to take care of one another, to take care of yourself, then you know, what was it all for? How are we doing on time? I think this is about the end of the first session. So there's a couple more tools in here. And as we get to know each other further, we're going to take a break. And then when we come back from the break, Lorenzo and I would like to have a conversation with you about the scaling challenges that you're having. We're going to try to design a program to support you. Of course, it's an optional program that you can decide to participate in or not, that would be available to start sometime after the event, probably starting in November. And it would be a program that would likely start with a couple days of working together here on site with myself and Lorenzo and his team and some of our colleagues from Silicon Valley, and then continuing on in kind of a virtual setting. Part of the program would be based on needs that everyone shares, that we determine together, and other parts would be very personalized to you and your specific challenges. So one of the questions that it's going to be very important for, at least for me to understand, is where are you scaling to, right? Because you're in one market now, and we heard both of the speakers this morning describe, their journey to scaling to North America because it was a large homogeneous market that allowed them to go faster. That's not the only way to do things. I'm interested in hearing, where are you scaling to? How are you building that big market? Typically, when you decide to scale or relocate, you got to pick a place. So the guys from Docebo picked Atlanta. That's an interesting choice that kind of supports, what I think, which is you really got to pick the ecosystem you're scaling to. So it's not just about going to the United States or going to Canada or going to Germany. It's, why am I going to that particular place in that country? Is it because my industry, my customer base is largely concentrated there? I'm an enterprise platform, and the #1 city with corporate headquarters in my industry is this city? Or is it because, in this country, in this city, there's a great surplus of the kind of talent that I need, and there's government incentives that are going to give me non-dilutive capital for the next 2 years? So very interested in getting to know from each of you how you see that journey progressing. What are the things you're looking for? Where are you thinking of going to build this market or to grow your organization? The Rainforest Canvas, I should start by mentioning, there's a great book, if you haven't seen it, called The Rainforest by Victor Huang. Victor is now Vice President of Ecosystem Development at the Kauffman Foundation. Before that, he was a venture capitalist, but this is a fantastic book that was published in 2014 that describes what are the things that make an ecosystem work. And if you read the book and then you look at this simple canvas, it's a quick way to think about another place that you might go to do business and to quickly assess, to have a framework for assessing what are the things that you're looking for in a place that you're scaling to. And if you can categorize them and define them, then it's easier to research them and, and then compare places. So this is a good framework for that. And then, we often talk about Silicon Valley as, sort of the sine qua non for the best place for scaling. There's a resource out there, the Global Economic Development Index, which ranks startup ecosystems by their productivity. GEDI, it's a not-for-profit that conducts studies in many ecosystems. I would encourage you to go check that out and read it and understand the variables that they use to evaluate different ecosystems, which are typically countries or sometimes big cities. And then there's a second resource called Startup Genome, which produces a study every several years that ranks cities. And Silicon Valley is always the baseline, so 100% at each variable is Silicon Valley, and then other places compared to that. Silicon Valley, however, is not the right answer for a lot of people, right? As we described, there's a talent shortage. It's extraordinarily expensive to live there. Valuations are through the roof. Going to Atlanta for the Docebo was probably, a really smart move. There's a lot of cities that are close to, but it's important to have a sense of why you're going where you're going if you're planning on going somewhere. So the Startup Genome ranks things like access to funding, company performance, how successful are the companies that start there, how available is the talent, how much support do you find from the ecosystem, what is the mindset in this community? Is it a place that believes that it can succeed? Like a football team that has a history of winning will keep winning because it believes that it can win. Does the ecosystem believe it can win, or is it a place that's trapped in its own failings or sense of inadequacy? Also, the trendsetter is a measure of to what extent are things truly unique happening in this place, or do you go to this place and the startups are the same kind of things that everybody else is starting, or is this place, for whatever reason, has a cluster of real expertise in several particular areas, and maybe that would be a great place for you because you're similar to those areas, right? So. The startup genome compares a lot of different ecosystems and ranks them on this. So if you're thinking about going somewhere, think a little bit more deeply about where and why and what are the characteristics you're looking for. And I'm just making you aware that these are resources out there that are quite helpful just from a research standpoint. So that's all I've got for now. Look forward to the conversation when we come back from the break.